A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugereicht waren Brüder in Amerika. Verkaufen Schabbat, es ist Gitter.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geber.
Welcome, everyone, to Jewish History Soundbites. This is Yehuda Geber with another episode of Jewish History Soundbites. And this episode is once again dedicated by the Schonfeld family, L'zecher Nishmas Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld. And this is part 2 of the story of Rabbi Schonfeld and how that's a prism to the Jewish world of the 20th century. So part 1, we discussed his growing up in Vienna and his escape from the Nazis, the kindertransport, his years in England, his early years in the United States. And here we move on to the rabbinic world that he becomes a part of. In 1952, there's a shul that starts in a basement in Kew Garden Hills, and he becomes the Young Israel of Kew Garden Hills, and he's informally the rabbi at first, which is very often how these things happen. And then the neighborhood grows, and people are moving in. They're moving out of the Brooklyn neighborhoods to further out, as Kew Gardens is already deep into Queens, and they have a building. Eventually, there's a group of dedicated balabatim laymen who build the shul, and they built the neighborhood. In fact, the shul affiliated with the shul initially is a Talmud Torah, which funds the shul tuition. It's a private school. There's at one point 500 children in this Talmud Torah in Kew Garden Hills that was affiliated with the shul. So Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld joins the RCA, and he eventually becomes president of the RCA, Rabbinical Council of America. So he influences both his shul, and then the local neighborhood scene, and then the larger national rabbinic scene. And the biggest issue at that time was the Synagogue Council. The Synagogue Council was also a great story. It was a unified Synagogue Council between all the denominations in American Jewish life, of Reform, Conservative, Reconstruction, and to a limited extent also the Orthodox. So the RCA was officially involved for many years. The OU was officially involved for many years. There's a famous letter in the 1950s from the 11 Rosh Yeshiva forbidding the involvement. Rabbi Schonfeld pointed out that Rav Soloveitchik, he was not in favor of the Synagogue Council, but he wasn't against it. So there's, something that, you could use it. So that was a struggle at the time that he had to grapple with. And that put him in a position, a political position. He was the head of the RCA. In fact, he, and during the Nixon administration, when the Vietnam War was raging, so they wanted to draft, it sounds almost like an Israel story or Russian story. Here you have it in America. They wanted to change the law that eventually, I guess not only yeshiva students, all divinity students, presumably, would be drafted into the United States Army, the military. So they had to lobby to protect the yeshiva students. So him in this capacity, in a rabbinical capacity, as head of the RCA, which God forbid was part of the Synagogue Council, he used that as a platform to help the yeshiva guys get out of the draft in the American Army, and to his credit, he was able to stop it. That was the beginning of his political affiliation. He eventually delivered a prayer at the 1980 Republican National Convention of Ronald Reagan, who he subsequently met several times. But he wasn't just a national rabbi, he was a pulpit rabbi, a rabbi who was close with his community. He was a rabbi's rabbi. There were widows in his community who he called every Shabbos for decades, every Erev Shabbos, every Friday before Shabbos for decades. He was comfortable in all worlds. He, got along with everybody. He had friends who were bishops and reform rabbis and politicians and the greatest Rosh Yeshiva. We'll speak soon, hopefully, about his close relationship with Reb Aaron Kotler. So he's a rabbi in the Young Israel, and officially he's in the RCA and part of the Yeshiva University world. But his Ne'ilah speech every year was in Yiddish, because he felt that before Ne'ilah, how could you speak in anything but Yiddish? He was a tremendous orator as well, and he had packed audiences by his Shabbos Hagadol drushes. So he was very much in all worlds. He wasn't just a orator. He paskined all kinds of thorny, complicated questions. In fact, just recently, when there was all kinds of coronavirus questions arising during the first wave, and people like Rabbi Shechter and other big poskim were grappling with questions about pushing off burial because you couldn't bury right away. So Rabbi Shechter remembered that in the 1960s, 50 years earlier, Rabbi Schonfeld had written a tshuva on the matter because there was a gravedigger strike in the state of Israel, and the question arose about pushing off a burial there as well. And they applied that halachic decision that he made in the 60s to the contemporary issue of the coronavirus. So in fact, there was once a official dinner or meeting in Yerushalayim that he was with the Prime Minister Yitzchak Shamir, and he was sitting next to a prominent Reform rabbi, Alexander Schindler, who was one of the prominent rabbis in the Reform Judaism. And he noticed that he kept on looking at his watch. He's sitting here with the Israeli Prime Minister. What's going on? So he said, Rabbi Schonfeld said, I have a meeting with the Ger Rebbe, the Pnei Menachem. So Alexander Schindler said, you believe in Rebbes? He said, of course I believe in Rebbes. And he started to tell him who the Pnei Menachem is. So this Schindler, he said, I don't believe in Rebbes. And he said, I'll tell you something. When I was a young boy, I got a blessing from a great Rebbe. And he said, I should have Yiras Shamayim. And look how I turned out. So you see, he can't believe in the Rebbe's blessing. So Rabbi Schonfeld, without missing a beat, he says to him, what do you mean? The blessing was fulfilled. You should have been a galach, you should have been a priest, and here you turned out you're a Reform rabbi. It's not so bad after all. And in fact, many pointed out the fact that Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld kept the RCA in line during his tenure there, and his influence, again, like not only at the national level, but in his own neighborhood. In fact, in Kew Gardens, he wasn't limited to influencing his own Shul Young Israel. He tried to help other minyanim get established in the neighborhood. When there was a new shtibel who tried to open up and they didn't have a minyan, and this new rabbi who was kind of intruding on his turf and intruding on his territory, he complained to Rabbi Schonfeld he doesn't have a minyan. Rabbi Schonfeld himself went for several weeks, not to his own shul. He went to this other rabbi's shul, to shtibel, to help him get him started in the neighborhood to get him in. And he would point out that he had three great teachers. His father, which is the influence of Ger Chasidus and the Ger Rebbes and the Sfas Emes, that world. And then there was, of course, Rav Soloveitchik. And then through the writings of Rav Hirsch, he felt himself that he was a student of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch as well in the whole Torah and Derech Eretz philosophy. And he felt that even though that they come from three different world views, but they really complemented each other, and there's a lot of similarities in their thought process. And he said, at heart, he's a Ger Chassid, but the Rav Soloveitchik was his main teacher. He once brought the Pnei Menachem to Rav Soloveitchik, in fact, and the Ger Rebbe said, you could see that he's the real brisk, whatever that means. And he said the trick was, in his accomplishment in life, Rav Schonfeld, was that he was able to get along with everyone. And he said he learned from Rav Soloveitchik that even when you disagree with people, don't call them names. No name calling. So a lot of name calling out there. You never insult anybody. You can disagree and argue, but never let it get personal. And he said, Rabbi Schonfeld said when he was in the hospital once, he got flowers from both the Hadassah Zionist organization and from Peace Now, from Shalom Achshav. And he had a lot of sharp disagreements with Peace Now. but they respected him and they sent him flowers when he was in the hospital. He said what makes someone a successful Rav is the emphasis on interpersonal relationships, on tolerance, and that was his greatest accomplishment. And his greatest accomplishment was building his shul, the Young Israel, in Kew Gardens, and also that he never did any name calling. So he had a lot of relationships with political leaders. Like I said, his first visit to Israel was in 1961. In fact, after his mother's tragic passing in a airplane crash, so his father forbade him from ever flying in a plane. So originally, when he went to visit Israel, he went by boat. But then in the late 60s, it already wasn't relevant anymore to go by boat. So he convinced his father, and his father allowed him to take a plane. He was also very close with President Ronald Reagan. One time, Reagan wanted to visit the shul on a campaign stop on Friday afternoon. And Rabbi Schonfeld did not allow it. He said he's worried that it would, because of the whole entourage and coming and going, it would cause Chil Shabbos. So he didn't allow President Reagan to come to speak in the shul on Friday afternoon. So instead, Reagan went to the local conservative temple. And once we're talking about campaign stops, so future President Carter and future President Clinton on their campaigns before they were president spoke at his shul. So he had a relationship with them as well. Like I said, he already had a affiliation with Nixon when it came to the draft during the Vietnam War, but he met Nixon again with a group of Jewish activists in the Oval Office, and Kissinger was there. And Nixon open the meeting. He said, "Look, the two main topics of the meeting were the Israeli-Arab conflict and the Soviet Jewry." And Nixon said, "I'm not pro-Arab and I'm not pro-Israel. I'm pro-peace." And he said, "Look how I resupplied the Israeli army during the Yom Kippur War." So he started off with these rabbis in the room to try to convince them that he's okay and he's a good guy. So Rabbi Schonfeld was involved in the President's Conference, in many amazing amount of Jewish organizations at the time, in Torah Messiah, in Chinuch Atzmai, which is how he was close to the Baron Kotler. He also, in fact, he met Colin Powell, and he said Colin Powell, who grew up in the Bronx, knew Yiddish. And when they had this meeting, and there was all kinds of Jewish activists there, so one of them started speaking to him in Yiddish, and he answered in perfect Yiddish. And not only that, but this person speaking to him says to him, "Du darf sagen whatever you have to say like this," and Colin Powell interrupted and said, "Ihr darf reden mit mir mit ihr, nicht du. You should speak to me in the respectful ear." The ear is a plural you, the royal you in Yiddish, and not do. Don't speak to me as do. That's disrespectful. So he even knew the subtleties of Yiddish, or knows. I think he's still around. And because he grew up in the Bronx, he dealt with Jews from a young age. But Rabbi Schonfeld he knew many Israeli politicians, Golda Meir. He once met Levi Eshkol after the 6-Day War. Levi Eshkol loved speaking Yiddish also. And Levi Eshkol told him, he said, after the 6-Day War, they got all this new territory. They got the Sinai and the West Bank and the Golan Heights. Levi Eshkol says to him, he said, the Naden is Ashena Naden. We got a good dowry. Over the Kala, he said, the Kala is the problem. He said, so that was Levi Eshkol's summation of the 6-Day War in a very Haimish way. Golda Meir actually came to speak in YU once. And when she spoke in YU, she said, "You know why I am what I am today?" And she was not religious by any definition of the word. She was nothing close. She was quite antagonistic, I should say. But this is what she said in Yeshiva University. She said, "My father, when he was in the Tsar's army, never ate treif, and that's why I'm able to be what I am today." Very interesting. But the closest politician he ever was with, and he considered him a personal friend, was with Menachem Begin. He also brought him to Yeshiva University to speak, and he spoke at his shul in Kew Gardens. He brought him to meet Rav Soloveitchik because Begin grew up in Brisk. So he said, it's interesting because this is a correction of what I said in a recent episode about Reb Simcha Zelig Rieger. I mentioned then that I saw a source that said that Begin witnessed Reb Simcha Zelig Rieger, the Brisker Dayan, getting beaten up by the Nazis during the war. And I said the story can't be, and it obviously means that Begin had faulty recollection because he was never in Brisk during the Second World War. So it turns out that what Begin himself said was a different story. So it wasn't a problem of Begin's recollection, it's a problem of misquoting of the sources. What it turns out that what Begin said to Rabbi Schonfeld was that when he was 7 years old, which was way many years before the war broke out, when he was a young child, he saw Reb Simcha Zelig Rieger, the Brisker Dayan, his beard getting tugged by a Polish anti-Semite. The Nazis didn't exist at the time, definitely not in Poland. So this was, and his father then stuck up for him, and he asked his father, how could you do that? He could have killed you. So Begin's father said to him two things. You can never allow a Jew's beard to get pulled by an anti-Semite, and even if they do kill you, you're dying al Kiddush Hashem. And Begin said, that's what keeps me going my entire life. Those two things. That never allow a Yid to get shepherded by a non-Jew, and if you get killed for it, so you're dying al Kiddush Hashem. And that's what he said. That's what Begin said kept him going his whole life. Rabbi Schonfeld lived, like I said in part one, he lived in all worlds. And he was able to get along with everyone from the, even knew Hussein, King Hussein of Jordan. He met him a couple of times. He was able to get along with everybody. But he said, my political connections, I don't like politics. I'm not involved in politics for glory or for anything else. Any involvement I have is to help the Jewish people. That's how he saw it. And that's how he saw Zionism. He said he's not Zionist in any political way. He's not in Zionism in any whatever the state says is holy. He's Zionist in the fact that it's Eretz Yisrael, that it's something that a Jewish state exists now. That's something that's very gratifying to him. So again, he was very nuanced in the way that he was able to react to the great events happening in the Jewish world in the 20th century with such a balance that he was able to get along with everybody. In fact, when after the 6-Day War, when they captured Har HaBayit B'Yadeinu, which is in the audio intro to every Jewish History Soundbites episode, so he got out on FDR Drive and he started dancing with his son, which very much embarrassed his son. But he got out in the middle of FDR Drive in Manhattan to start the dance. But he was very close with many of the great Torah leaders of his day. Like every Ger Rebbe, like I said in part one, the Pnei Menachem, we started with his father, with the Ger Rebbe, the Imrei Emes in Europe. He met Rameir Shapiro, like I mentioned. He met all these other great Torah leaders in Vienna as a child. He's also close as a rabbi, as a communal rabbi in the United States. He was very close with Rabbi Feinstein. One time, actually, there was a controversy involving Rav Shlomo Goren, the chief rabbi in Israel. So Rabbi Schonfeld was trying to be the go-between, so he went to speak to Rav Moshe Feinstein about it, and he said, it could be that Rav Goren is a shtickle meshuggah, is a little bit crazy, but he's a big Talmud Chacham. So Rav Moshe says to him, when you get on an airplane, if the pilot was a shtickle meshuggah, you would not get on the plane. So the Rav Rashi, the chief rabbi of the state of Israel, this is what Rav Moshe said, needs to be the pilot of the Jewish people. And therefore, we can't settle for anything less. Very, very interesting assessment. But one of his most interesting relationships was what he had with Reb Aaron Kotler. He knew Reb Aaron Kotler already in Vienna. He knew him. He met him as a child. And later on, he developed a close connection to him in America. Reb Aaron once called him in a letter that he wrote, Yedidi, my dear friend. Fascinating. So his main connection to Reb Aaron was when Reb Aaron was founding the Chinuch Atzmoi, and he was trying to get as much funding possible for the independent religious school system in Israel, which Reb Aaron founded it and took personal responsibility for. So he wanted the RCA to be able to run a campaign. How is Reb Aaron going to get a connection to the RCA? So he asked Rav Soloveitchik to get involved to help the RCA fundraiser. So he called Rav Soloveitchik, and so Rav Soloveitchik said, okay, yeah, Reb Aaron said, so no problem. So he needs to find a chairman to run the fundraiser. So Rav Soloveitchik called up Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld. It's in the mid-1950s, 56, I believe. And he said, I went through the lists of all my students, and the only one who I could think that it's appropriate for such a position is you. And therefore, you have to run I'm asking you to run the RCA campaign. So he said, okay, I'll do it. That's it. I'll do it. So when he gets back to his office, so he gets his secretary gets a phone call. The secretary was this American woman who did not know, European, Litvish, Yiddish. And she says to him, there's some old rabbi on the phone speaking in Yiddish. Old Jew. She didn't even know if it was a rabbi or not. So, okay. So he takes the phone and he said, yes. He says, Harav Schonfeld. He says, yes. He says, Reto Kotler. This is Kotler speaking. And he says, who? Who's Kotler? So he says, Kotler. He said, who is it? He was thrown off. He didn't know who it was. He says, Nu Kotler von Lakewood. He said, he said he wanted to faint on the spot. He said, Reb Aaron was on the phone. He says, what can I do for the Rosh Yeshiva? So he says, I just got off the phone with Rav Soloveitchik. I got off the phone with Rav Soloveitchik, and he told me that you're going to run the RCA campaign, and I wanted to call you to thank you. And I also want to wish you a bracha v'hatzlacha with the campaign. And so Reb Aaron, kept things going. So that got famously later that year there was a dinner where Rav Soloveitchik was the guest speaker and Reb Aaron was there, was being honored. So that was a very, very fascinating story about that connection there. Another story he had indirectly with Reb Aaron was when he was building his shul in Kew Garden Hills. So the architect that was building the shul was the same one that Reb Aaron had used to build Beis Medrash Gavoya in Lakewood. So he told him a story about Reb Aaron. So one time they were reviewing the plans and they ran into an engineering problem. Certain things couldn't fit in, but they couldn't figure out how to reconfigure the whole thing. So Reb Aaron came in and he asked, what's the problem? So they said, don't worry, Rosh Yeshiva, it's not for you. So he said, no, tell me the problem. So they explained him the problem, and literally within minutes he solved the whole thing. He redesigned it, he redid the numbers, the whole mathematical calculations, and they were amazed. They said, did you have a background in engineering, in mathematics? His older sister wanted him to have a background in mathematics, but he didn't. So he said, no, but if I could understand Rashi and Tosfos, then I can figure this out also. It's not a big deal. That was another story, indirect story he had with Reb Aaron. But he met Reb Aaron, like I said, when he was a young boy in Vienna. His father was, like I said, in part one, I said how his father was the general secretary of the World Aguda, and he was on the Vat HaPoel, the executive committee of Agudas Yisroel. His name was Shapsi Schonfeld. The central offices of the Aguda I mentioned in part one were in Vienna. So he took him along to see the great Torah leaders at these meetings. There was a Moyetzes Gedolei Torah meeting, so that one of them was in Vienna. And he said Reb Aaron was young. He was a short rabbi with a flaming red beard. And Yaakov Rosenheim chaired the meeting. And it was a very heated meeting. Reb Aaron got very heated and excited. So at one point he banged on the table with an inkwell that was sitting there on the table, and the ink got all over the table. And Rosenheim, who was a Yeki, and he was the chair of the meeting, he stops the meeting and he said, Harav Kotler, it says in the Gemara, Hashauver Kelim Bachamasau, the one who breaks kalim, the inkwell, in anger, and he didn't continue what the Gemara says. Now, the Gemara says that it's Ke'ilu Oived Avodah Zarah. Rosenheim, out of respect for Reb Aaron Kotler, didn't finish off that Gemara. So he said Reb Aaron felt bad afterwards, but that just shows how excited, and Reb Aaron was very, very strong-minded about any position he held. There was a dispute at one of the Aguda meetings that Reb Aaron used to come to Kew Garden Hills to fundraise for Lakewood. One time he asked Reb Aaron, why did you put a stop to the conventions, the rabbinical conventions that used to take place in Lakewood? Lakewood was a resort town at the time. There were all kinds of conventions. And at one point, Reb Aaron, didn't like it, so he put a stop to it. It shouldn't take place in Lakewood. So Rabbi Schonfeld asked him why. So he said because Rav Soloveitchik and very often many of his great rabbinical students would be the main speakers at these conventions. And my Talmidim in Lakewood would go see Rav Soloveitchik, and they'd see some of his Talmidim, and they'd be impressed. Look, these people can go to college and still be great Talmidei Chachamim and great Torah scholars. So I didn't want them to have that influence, because I disagree with that approach. And Rav Soloveitchik was able to do it, good for him. But it's not the education I want to give my own students. So I'm scared that they're going to be impressed by that. So I don't want these conventions to take place in Lakewood anymore. Another time, Rabbi Schonfeld asked Reb Aaron Kotler, when he came for a fundraiser, he used to bring his kids to see Reb Aaron. When he'd go to these parlor meetings, he would bring his little children to go see Reb Aaron. He said he got a chinuch from his own father in Vienna to meet Gedolei Yisroel, to meet the great Torah leaders. So he wanted to inculcate his own children with that philosophy as well. So he would bring them to meet Reb Aaron. So on another occasion, he asked Reb Aaron, I understand that you allow your students from Lakewood to become Hebrew teachers in conservative temples. Is that true, and why? So Reb Aaron said, of course, I allow it. He said, if you want to become a rabbi in a conservative temple, no way. No way. Why? Because then you're going to be swayed, you're going to be influenced by the Balabatim, by the laymen of the community who are going to, they're paying the rabbi's salary, they're going to influence him, he's going to have to listen to them. But if you're going to be a teacher in the Hebrew school, then you can influence the children. And that's exactly the opposite. We should I should send my Talmidim to become the Hebrew teachers at the Hebrew school, because then perhaps they can have a positive influence on the future of their traditional Jewish life. He met Reb Aaron many times to discuss issues in the RCA and the Agudas Yisroel, Torah Messiah, at different conventions and meetings. He said Reb Aaron cared about every little thing. At the Torah Messiah conventions in the early days was held at these Jewish hotels, which, they had mixed seating, and the kashrus was questionable. There was no official certification. So one time Reb Aaron was sitting at one of the tables at this Torah Messiah conventions. He witnessed this. Rabbi Schonfeld witnessed this. He saw this interaction right in front of him. And he called over the owner of the hotel. And he said, what goes on in the kitchen? Tell me about it. He started asking him. So he said, do you have non-Jews working in the kitchen? So he said, yes. He said, and what about Bishul Akum? So he said, I guess that's an issue. So he said, promise me that from now on, you're going to always ensure that a Jew will turn on the fire. And he said that Reb Aaron, he himself, he wasn't going to eat there. It wasn't that he was hungry and he was ensuring that this Jewish hotel that so many Jews were patronizing would now have at least a kashrus issue taken care of. Rabbi Aaron Kotler is also, Rabbi Schonfeld seems to have been involved in at a later point. But when the state of Israel was founded and the Agudas Yisroel joined the government, Rabbi Aaron had a big dispute with the Israeli Aguda against them. He said they should leave the government. They should not be participants in the Israeli government. And it was a whole dispute within the Aguda. Rabbi Aaron was very strongly in his position that they should not be part of the government, while the Israeli Aguda, led by Rabbi Shemaiah Levin, the son-in-law of the Ger Rebbe, refused. And there was it was a whole disagreement at that time. And Rabbi Aaron never yielded 1 inch. He knew what he believed in, and he stayed with it the entire way. Rav Soloveitchik, he said, came to the Levaya Rabbi Aaron, but they did not invite him to speak, and he was very upset about that. He was very disappointed. He planned on giving his own hesped later on in in the yeshiva in Rabbinic Chassidim, but that never worked out. And then, of course, Rabbi Schonfeld was also the one who met Rabbi Aaron Cutler's older sister in the old age home in Washington Heights. And he said, she asked him, what do you want to become? He said, I want to become a rabbi. He said, don't become a rabbi. My younger brother became a rabbi and nothing became of him. You ever heard of him? He's in Lakewood. Aaron Cutler. He's a Malamed. A successful Malamed. That's what he became. That was her perspective. But he did say, Rabbi Schonfeld did say that Rabbi Aaron would take care of her. I mentioned this on another episode. Rabbi Aaron would visit her once a week and make sure she was fed and taken care of, and very dedicated to that sister. So that's part one. This is part two about the world, the living history, the prism into Jewish life of the 20th century through the life story of Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld. So this was Yehudi Geber of Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or on your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.